Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. India has decided to send a team to the United Nations Security Council's 1267 Sanctions Committee to designate the Resistance Front as a terror group. India has also released the names of Pakistan army personnel and police who attended a terrorist's funeral. US President Donald Trump has landed in Saudi Arabia, his first major diplomatic trip during his second term. The president was greeted on the tarmac by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ahead of visits to Qatar and the UAE, aiming to secure new investments. Meanwhile, amidst heightened regional tensions, Iran's Armed Forces Chief of Staff Bagheri warns neighbours to stay neutral ahead of Trump's visit. Bagheri says any aggression against Iran will lead to irreparable losses and damages for attackers. Chinese President Xi Jinping says China will commit credit lines of almost $10 billion to Latin American countries while slamming bullying and hegemonism. At the CELAC Forum, Xi announced plans to deepen ties at a time of bloc confrontation. China's foreign ministry says the responsibility of tackling the fentanyl crisis lies with the United States. Tariffs had been imposed on China over the flow of fentanyl, though recent talks have seen a sharp reduction in levies which stood at over 100% both ways. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has spoken with his European counterparts as Allied unity continues ahead of Russia-Ukraine peace talks. Zelensky says he will attend talks in Turkey on Thursday as Russia's Lavrov speaks with the Turkish Foreign Minister on peace. Former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, who is in prison at The Hague over alleged war crimes, has been elected as mayor of his home city. Votes continue to be counted after crucial midterm elections in the Philippines. A man has been arrested in connection with fires that have been reported at properties linked to the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Counter-terrorism police have been investigating the apparent arson incidents in North London. We start this hour as Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Air Force Station Adampur amid rising tensions following a failed Pakistani attempt to strike the airbase. Pakistan later falsely claimed it had successfully hit the base and caused damage. On the other hand, India has now presented evidence to the United Nations Security Council of Pakistan's complicity in terrorism following the precision strikes of Operation Sindoor on May the 7th. These strikes killed over 100 terrorists. Videos and photos from the funerals of the killed terrorists show Pakistani army officials in attendance, including senior figures such as Lieutenant General Fayaz Hussain Shah and Major General Rao Imran Sartaj. Pakistan has denied any links to terrorism, but the presence of military officials at these funerals, including the presence of terrorist leader Hafiz Abdul Rauf, paints a different picture. Pakistan has dismissed Rauf's terrorist ties, claiming he is a religious leader. However, his designation as a terrorist by the United States and the United Nations suggests otherwise. Moving on now, US President Donald Trump has arrived in Saudi Arabia today, kicking off a multi-day tour of the Gulf. Trump brought along top members of his cabinet as well as US business figures, including his advisor Elon Musk. Saudi fighter jets escorted Air Force One as Trump landed in the capital of Riyadh. Trump will address an investment forum in Riyadh and later in the week head to Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, fellow oil-rich Arab monarchies with long ties to the United States. The trip marks the US president's first major visit aboard of his second term, with the White House saying he looked forward to a historic region 8 years ago, Trump also chose Saudi Arabia for his first overseas trip as president. His decision to once again bypass traditional Western allies to travel to the oil-rich Gulf states underscores their increasingly crucial geopolitical role, along with his own business relations in the region. Heading to the Middle East, an Israeli-American hostage was released after 19 months in captivity in Gaza during a brief pause in fighting and reunited with his family. Israel's military received Edan Alexander from the International Committee of the Red Cross, which facilitated his transfer from Hamas. The release was reportedly intended as a goodwill gesture and as part of efforts to reach a new ceasefire deal ahead of US President Donald Trump's visit to the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called Alexander's return a very moving moment and thanked Trump for his support. According to Netanyahu, the release had been made possible because of military pressure on Hamas and the political pressure exerted by President Trump. Hamas, however, has denied this claim. He added that Israel intended to continue with plans to intensify its military actions in Gaza and that there would be no ceasefire. Meanwhile, Hamas had earlier said that Alexander's release was intended to facilitate a deal for the entry of humanitarian aid into the enclave. Hamas had also stated that it will only agree to a deal that includes the end of the war, which has been repeatedly rejected by Netanyahu. With Trump in the Middle East, Israel has vowed to expand its military offensive against Hamas if no deal is reached by the end of his visit. Well, meanwhile, Tehran and Washington are currently engaged in indirect talks over Iran's nuclear program and sanctions relief. These discussions, which began on April the 12th in Amman, saw their most recent round conclude this past Sunday. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has described this latest round as much more serious in nature. In the latest turn of events, Major General Mohammad Bagheri, Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, recently assessed the operational readiness of military forces in the strategic Persian Gulf region. Accompanied by senior military leaders, including Army Commander-in-Chief and Navy Commander Rear Admiral, Bagheri inspected naval and combat units in Bandar Abbas and the surrounding coastal areas. The purpose of his visit was to evaluate the operational status of Iran's forces in the region and ensure the full preparedness of both the Army's strategic naval force and the IRGC Navy to protect Iran's territorial and international waters. Bagheri stressed that Iranian armed forces are fully ready to respond to any potential threat, and he assured commanders that no scenario will catch the country off guard or go unanswered. In light of these developments, Bagheri warned foreign adversaries that Iran will decide how, when and where any conflict with the country ends. He added that any hostile action against Iran's territory will be met with strong and decisive force. This statement comes as US President Donald Trump arrives in Saudi Arabia to begin a tour of the Middle East, which also includes visits to Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Trump's visit comes at a time when his administration faces persistent challenges in the region, particularly in relation to both Israel and Iran. Moving on now, but staying with diplomacy, China is strengthening its ties with Latin America, offering nearly $10 billion in yuan-denominated credit and introducing visa-free travel for several countries in the region. President Xi Jinping made the announcement at the China CELAC Forum in Beijing, a platform Beijing uses to bolster economic and strategic cooperation with Latin America. The credit line is seen as part of China's push to internationalize the yuan, shifting trade away from the dollar while encouraging infrastructure and development projects. Xi also said trade with CELAC members hit a record $515 billion in 2024, fueled by China's demand for food, energy and raw materials. Among those attending the forum were Brazilian President Lula da Silva, Chilean President Gabriel Boric and Colombian President Gustavo Petro. Besides trade, Xi called for deeper cooperation in areas including clean energy, 5G, cybersecurity, AI and counter-terrorism. The summit comes as Latin America has become a key strategic arena in the geopolitical tussle between Beijing and Washington. Well, following these conversations, we are joined by a guest to discuss the talks that have taken place, but also the ramifications. We're joined by Srikanth Kondapalli, a professor of China Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Thank you very much for being here, Srikanth. The first thing I want to look at is this relationship between China and Latin American countries. It's of course something that's been brought up by the Trump administration, but how significant is this alliance with China?
Well, the China CELAC meeting is important for China because there are 600 million consumers in Latin America and Caribbean. They have a total GDP of nearly $6 trillion. In the light of the Trump tariff wars, China wants to diversify its trade figures with other countries, including with the Latin American and Caribbean countries. So this $500 billion actually represents the second largest trading partnership for China. It used to be just about $12 billion 24 years ago, and now it has increased to $500 billion, quite substantial increase in the trade. Secondly, the Chinese look at the Caribbean region and Latin America because this is a backyard of the United States. Since the United States has come to the backyard of China in terms of East China Sea, South China Sea, and others, China today wants to go into the American backyard and exert pressure on the United States. So United States has the Monroe Doctrine, which the Chinese want to violate and become a stakeholder in the Latin American countries. And for this, they have to become the largest trading partner, which they are on their way to become one. Second is investments and others. These are packaged in the Belt and Road Initiative projects, which is pretty active in the Latin American countries. So this is another consideration for China to balance the United States. They mention this as part of multipolarity, which basically means moving away from the United States influence. The third area where China wants to exert its pressure on Latin America is also in terms of the aid given to these so that they can depend on China. So as a part of the aid program, China released a white paper on Latin America some years ago, and they have been announcing a slew of measures for increasing aid to the Latin American countries and of course Caribbean. So this has increased substantially, and much of these are in healthcare, education, infrastructure projects, and others.
Yes.
Fourth main area of attention is in the space program. China has signals intelligence facilities in Cuba. It also has a CBERS, China-Brazil Earth observation satellite program with Brazilians, because Brazil has a high-tech sector, Embraer aircraft they used to produce. So China is tapping into the Brazilian space as well as aerospace programs. So this is another consideration for China.
Yes, absolutely, Srikanth. Of course, amid global tariff pressure from the United States and trade tensions, we have seen Xi visit countries within East Asia. Of course, he went to Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, looking to strengthen trade ties. Do you think the significance of the US tariffs means that this meeting has a bit more significance behind it?
Yes, indeed. However, yesterday there was a meeting in Geneva between He Lifeng, the Vice Premier, and the US Treasury Secretary, and they cobbled up some kind of an arrangement on trade and tariff issues. We do not have all the details, but this will be a 90-day kind of reprieve from the 245% tariffs imposed by President Trump on China, and China retaliated with 145% on the United States products. So now both of them agreed to reduce these to about 10% on each other, but after 90 days, try to resolve the trade and tariff. So this has come in the background of this CELAC meeting. Of course, CELAC meeting has been organized quite a long time ago. However, the US-China trade deal that was concluded yesterday was a different one, but it indicated that China and the US are trying to come to an arrangement on the trade and tariffs. If that were to be so, the CELAC will lose some significance in terms of the US-China relations.
Yes.
Having said that, the Trump administration has actively participated in the Panama Canal related controversy, where a Chinese company was doing the dredging projects for a few $100 million. So this is one of the main grouses of China in terms of the Panama Canal. So it looks like the Trump administration is reiterating the Monroe Doctrine, which means that we will probably see some differences or even conflict between China and the US in the Panama Canal, South American, and other regions in the vicinity.
Yes, Srikant, we are coming to the end of our discussion, but there are a couple of points I want to touch on before we let you go. Of course, visa-free travel is one, but I want to look at this credit line. Of course, doing research on this and with your knowledge, we have an understanding of what this means, but for our audience, can you explain what this is? Over $9 billion credit line to these Latin American countries, which is equivalent to around 66 billion yuan. What is a credit line and how will that help these Latin American countries?
Well, this is still a black box, but let me explain in simple words. Chinese state-owned enterprises and banks like the Exim Bank, Export-Import Bank, CDB, China Development Bank, or PBOC, People's Bank of China, or other state-owned state-owned banks, they provide credit for specific countries and specific industries. And these credits, we do not know on how much would be the loan, because prior to the dispersing of credit, they have to sign a sovereign agreement, an MOU, where they are not supposed to disclose the details of the credit line. So only one African country, Ghana, had come out of this secrecy clause and showed to the international community that the loans are coming at a very high interest rate, sometimes at 5%. For example, the Hanoi Metro in Vietnam was at 5%. Also, the projects in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, or other countries are at very high interest rate. But these countries will not be able to tell us in public because they signed an agreement with China. So this is the root cause of debt diplomacy. And China exerts a lot of pressure on these countries not to disclose the provisions of these credit lines. So it is still a black box. We do not know exactly what is the percentage of interest that is asked from these recipient countries. Universally, it is 0.02%. If you take a loan from IMF, World Bank, or Dubai Holdings, Singapore Holdings, or the ODA of Japan. However, the Chinese interest rate go up to nearly 0.5%. This is the bane of many of the Belt and Road Initiative projects, and this has led to a lot of debt for these countries. There is a study in Maryland University which suggested that 16 to 17 countries in the world today who are part of the Belt and Road Initiative are in debt.
Srikant, thank you ever so much for detailing interests surrounding these loans. Of course, any updates that come from further discussions, we will bring those to you, and we will of course be across the ongoing trade tensions. But we stay now with China, which has hit back at the United States over its fentanyl crisis, calling on Washington to stop smearing and shifting blame. This comes just a day after both countries agreed to a temporary reduction in tariffs under the new agreement. The US will lower its tariffs on Chinese goods to 30%, while China will cut its own to 10%. But Beijing is furious that the US is still imposing an extra 20% tariff linked to Trump's complaints over Chinese chemical exports used to make the drug fentanyl. Chinese firms produce and export the precursor chemicals required to manufacture fentanyl, which ends up crossing into the US, often via Mexican cartels. The US has been grappling with a deadly opioid epidemic, with fentanyl being a major driver of overdose deaths. Washington has long maintained that Beijing isn't doing enough to curb chemical exports, an allegation China firmly denies. Let's have a listen in to Lin Jian, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson.
美方无视中方的善意，对中国无理加征芬太尼关税，这严重冲击中美在禁毒领域的对话与合作，也严重损害中方利益。美方如果真心想同中方合作，就应该停止对华抹黑推责，在平等、以平等、尊重、互惠的方式同中方对话。
Let's now take our focus to Europe, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that he hopes for a ceasefire with Russia starting on Monday, and that he will be waiting for Putin in Turkey personally, referring to the Russian president's offer for direct peace talks in Istanbul. This comes after Zelensky said on Sunday that Ukraine's proposal of a ceasefire starting on Monday remained on the table, and that Kyiv was still waiting for a response from Russia. This came after he insisted there must be a full temporary ceasefire in place before the negotiations proposed by Putin could start. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has stated that the Russian side is preparing for the talks. However, that is all they can say at this point, and do not intend to comment further. Ukraine has responded to this and said that Putin skipping the talks would be the final signal that Moscow does not have any intentions of ending the war. United States President Donald Trump had posted on Sunday on his Truth Social platform that Putin doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather that he wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate a possible end to the quote-unquote bloodbath, and that Ukraine should agree to this immediately. Following this, Trump said on Monday that he was thinking about flying over for direct Zelensky-Putin talks in Turkey. Zelensky has backed the idea of Trump attending. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio held a call with his European counterparts, including the foreign ministers of Britain and France, as well as the EU's foreign policy chief, to discuss a way forward for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha and his German and Polish counterparts also took part in this call, according to a State Department readout. Moreover, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan held a phone conversation with his Ukrainian counterpart on Monday and reiterated Turkey's commitment to facilitating peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, according to a statement by Erdogan's office. In a stunning twist in the Philippine midterm elections, former President Rodrigo Duterte has been elected mayor of his family stronghold in Davao. This comes despite the former leader being detained in The Hague and awaiting a trial by the International Criminal Court. The 80-year-old populist's return to local power is a symbolic blow to President Marcos Jr. He had approved Duterte's arrest earlier this year, a move that has since ignited a political civil war between the two once allied families. Duterte's win solidifies his family's grip over the southern region, even as his daughter, Vice President Sara Duterte, faces an impeachment trial backed by the Marcos camp. With 80% of the votes counted, only 5 Senate seats have gone to Marcos allies. This is much lower than expected, while 5 have also been snapped up by supporters of the Duterte camp. Moving on now, Bangladesh's Election Commission has suspended the registration of the ousted Awami League, preventing the party from contesting upcoming elections. The decision follows a government ban on all party activities under the Anti-Terrorism Act after deadly protests swept the country. Former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina fled to India last year, facing war crimes investigations along with senior party leaders. The interim government, led by Mohammed Yunus, cites national security concerns. Once revered for the role in the 1971 Liberation War, the Awami League is now barred from political activities, media appearances and public rallies until further notice. National elections may be delayed to 2026 amid calls for major reforms. Moving on, the United Nations Aviation Council has formally ruled that Russia is responsible for the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine, which killed all 298 people on board. The case was filed by the Netherlands and Australia, whose citizens made up the majority of the victims. The International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, will now consider what form of reparation should follow. Earlier in 2022, a Dutch court convicted 3 men in absentia for their roles in the attack, 2 Russians and a Ukrainian. Moscow has refused to extradite the convicted, calling the trial politically motivated. The ICAO itself has not yet issued a public statement. British police have arrested a 21-year-old man in connection with suspected arson attacks on 2 properties linked to the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The man was taken into custody early on Tuesday on suspicion of arson with intent to endanger life. The fires, which took place in North London over the past few days, were linked to Starmer, who still owns the former family home targeted in the incident. Police have also connected the fires to a vehicle fire on May the 8th and a separate blaze at a property converted into flats. The investigation is being led by the Counter-Terrorism Command due to the Prime Minister's high profile. Police have declared all 3 fires as suspicious and inquiries are ongoing. Moving now to Africa, a group of 59 white South Africans have arrived in the United States, where they will be granted refugee status after the Trump administration expedited their applications. President Trump claimed the group was fleeing racial discrimination in South Africa. However, the South African government has rejected these claims, stating the group is not facing persecution. This move has sparked outrage, with human rights groups calling it racial bias. The US has halted refugee admissions from war zones, leading to complaints over unequal treatment. South Africa has also criticised the US, particularly over land reform and the Trump administration's policy on farmer attacks. The claims of genocide against white South African farmers have been widely disputed. Let's hear what the US Deputy Secretary of State has had to say.
The President made it clear that Afrikaners in South Africa who were the victims of unjust racial discrimination would be welcome to come to the United States, and he's now delivering on all of these folks who have just come in today have been carefully vetted pursuant to our refugee standards, and whether or not the broader refugee programs for other people around the world will be lifted is still an ongoing consideration. But again, the President has recognized the dire situation of this particular group of people, and again, they went through the process.
And moving over to North America, a number of witnesses have taken to the stand in the trial of Sean Diddy Combs, who is facing allegations of racketeering and sex trafficking during his time as head of an entertainment empire. Prosecutors said in opening statements of the federal sex trafficking trial that Combs used violence and threats of reputational ruin to control women he abused for years. Meanwhile, the rapper's attorney defended his swingers lifestyle. On day one of the trial, the panel of 12 jurors and 6 alternates responsible for determining Combs' fate heard of the famed artist's explosive outbursts and an attempt to preserve his own reputation and power through bribery. The 55-year-old has pleaded not guilty to the charges. The trial is scheduled to continue today, where Combs' former girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, is expected to testify. Well, that is all we have time for, but we will continue to bring you more of the latest breaking news from across the world.